The station was called the Eternal Accord, and it floated in the dark space, above a gas giant that had no name, only a number in a star catalog nobody really used anymore. The gas giant was orange and brown and enormous, and the station above it was even more impressive. Massive ring of silver and gold metal, spinning slowly, full of lights and corridors and rooms where the most powerful beings in the galaxy came to talk and make rules and decide the fate of smaller civilizations. Ambassador LRA Vasquez stood at the window of her transport ship and looked at the station as her small vessel moved toward the docking bay. She was not a tall woman. She was not a physically intimidating woman. She had short, dark hair, brown skin, and quiet eyes that missed nothing. She had worked her entire career in diplomacy, starting as a junior translator at the age of 24 and climbing slowly, carefully, year by year, until the Secretary General of Earth had personally asked her to take this assignment. She had said yes without hesitating. Her transport was small, just a two-person crew and a single cabin for her. The Galactic Council had not offered humanity larger ship for this trip. That was already a message, and LRA had read it the moment the travel details arrived on her desk. She did not pack more than one bag. She did not bring advisors or assistants or security personnel. She brought herself one bag, a data pad, and a sealed encrypted message from the Secretary General that she was only allowed to open once she was aboard the station. The docking bay opened like a mouth and swallowed her ship whole when the doors behind her sealed and the pressurization completed. LRA picked up her single bag, tucked the data pad under her arm, and walked out into the Eternal Accord. The first thing she noticed was that several delegates were already there, watching her arrive. This was not normal protocol. Delegates did not come to watch other delegates get off their ships, but there they were, a cluster of tall, gray-skinned Velhari, standing to the left of the docking corridor, and two representatives of the K-Dominion standing further back, almost in shadow. One of the KE representatives said something quietly to the other, and they both made a sound that LRA had learned long ago was the KE equivalent of a laugh. She looked at them and nodded once politely and kept walking. The corridor that led from the docking bay to the main residential level was long and curved slightly upward. Walls were made of a dark, polished material that reflected light in faint rainbow patterns, and the ceiling was high enough that even the tallest species in the council could walk comfortably. The whole station had been designed to make everyone feel welcome, which in practice meant it had been designed to make no single species feel like they owned it. But after 40 years of watching council politics, LRA knew that the Keth Dominion owned most of what mattered here: the votes, the committees, the informal agreements that happened in dining rooms and private lounges before any official session ever began. A young council aide met her at the end of the corridor. The aide was a Myrai, small, blue-skinned, with 4 thin arms and enormous amber eyes. The Maradi were efficient and professional and had served the council for over 3 centuries. They were also, in Elra's experience, very good at pretending not to have opinions. Ambassador Vasquez, the aide, said, "Welcome to the Eternal Accord. I am Coordinator Cell, and I will be your point of contact during the summit. Your quarters are on level 7, the negotiation Summit begins in 36 standard hours. Thank you, Cell LRA said, is Elder. V. Thorne already aboard, the aide blinked. A small hesitation. Yes, he arrived too. Days ago, LRA nodded and followed the aide to the elevator. Her room on level 7 was clean and functional. A bed, a desk, a window that looked out at the gas. Giant below, a small screen on the wall showed the current list of attendees for the summit's 17 civilizations. LRA counted the names and recognized all of them. She knew their histories, their economies, their old grudges, and their quiet deals with the Keth. She had read every file, every trade record, and every vote those civilizations had cast in the council chamber over the last 20 years. She set her bag down, sat at the desk, and opened the encrypted message from the Secretary General. She read it. Once she read it again, she sat very still for almost a full minute. Then she closed the message, put the data pad face down on the desk, and looked out at the orange gas giant below. She did not smile yet, but something behind her eyes changed. In a much larger and much more comfortable suite on level 3, Elder V. Thorne of the Galactic Council was already holding a private meeting. V. Than was ancient by most species standards, over 400 years old, with pale violet skin and long white hair that he kept tied back in a formal arrangement. He had governed council proceedings for 90 years, and in that time he had overseen the integration of 11 new civilizations, the resolution of 4 interstellar conflicts, and the quiet elimination of 2 civilizations that had refused to cooperate with council directives. He was not cruel. He simply understood that the galaxy ran on order, and order required that smaller, newer civilizations understand their place. Sitting across from him was Executive Drax of the Keth Dominion, a broad, dark-scaled being with copper-colored eyes and the kind of stillness that made other species nervous. Drax was the Keth's lead diplomat and had been for 30 years. He was very good at making aggression look like generosity. She came alone, said one of Ethan's aides, a small creature standing near the door. Yes, V. Thorne said. He looked at Drax. The humans always send someone reasonable. They believe in the process. It is their greatest flaw, Drax said. They spent 40 years trying to be liked. They have not yet understood that being liked in this council means being useful to someone stronger. V. Thorne folded his hands on the table. The accord of mutual limitation is ready for presentation. The language has been reviewed by all cooperating delegations. The Velhari have agreed to abstain rather than oppose, which is effectively the same as support the trade. Incentives we offered the Sauron and the Paladi were enough to bring them to our side. He paused. The humans will have no allies in that chamber. Drax made a low sound of satisfaction, and when they refuse to sign, they will not refuse, V. Thorne said calmly. They will protest, they will argue, they may ask for amendments, they will call for more time, and eventually, as they always do, they will negotiate, they will accept something slightly less terrible than what we first offered, and they will call it a victory. He leaned back in his chair. It is what they do. Humans negotiate. It is their identity. It is the thing they are most proud of. Drax looked at the door as if he could see through the corridor walls all the way to level 7, and if this one is different, V. Thorne considered the question for a moment. He had read LRA Vasquez's file. He knew her record. She Was good, careful, and patient, and intelligent, but she was still one diplomat from a civilization that had spent 40 years asking for permission. She is not different, he said. She is just the latest one they sent to ask. Nicely, the meeting ended and the aides left and the station continued its slow spin above the nameless gas giant. On Level 7, LRA Vasquez was not sleeping. She was sitting at her desk, with her data pad open, going through documents she had already memorized. She was not nervous. She was not afraid. She was doing what she had done for her entire career. She was paying attention. But tonight, for the first time in a very long time, she was paying attention to something that had already happened, rather than something she was trying to prevent. The encrypted message from the Secretary General had not been instructions. It had not been a strategy document or a list of concessions or a diplomatic framework. It had been 4 sentences, and those 4 sentences had told her that while the Council was busy building a cage, humanity had already walked through a door that no one else in the galaxy even knew existed yet. She closed the data pad and finally allowed herself to smile. Tomorrow she would be polite. She would be patient. She would listen to every word of their well-prepared dreb, and then she would say one thing that would change everything. The Grand Hall of Accord was the largest room on the Eternal Accord Station, and it had been built specifically to make everyone inside it feel the weight of history. The ceiling was so high it almost disappeared into shadow. The walls were carved from a single massive asteroid that had been hollowed out over 200 years ago. The seats rose in curved rows all around a central floor where the speaking platform stood, and every seat was filled. 2,000 delegates, aides, translators, and observers sat in those rising rows, and the noise of all of them settling and murmuring and arranging their materials was like a low wave of sound that filled the entire room. LRA walked to the human delegation's assigned position, a single seat and a single small table near the center of the floor level. There was no elevated platform for her, no extra chairs for staff who did not exist. She sat down, placed her data pad on the table, folded her hands, and waited. The session opened with ceremony, as council sessions always did. Elder V. Thorin descended to the speaking platform in long formal robes of deep blue and silver. He spoke for 12 minutes about the history of the Galactic Council, about the importance of cooperation and collective stability, and about the great responsibility that every civilization in the hall carried when it came to the shared future of the galaxy. His voice was smooth and measured, and the translation devices built into every delegate's seat rendered his words in real time into whatever language each listener needed. LRA listened and understood every word in its original language. She did not need the translation device. When V. Thorn finished his opening remarks, he gestured toward Exeter Drax, who rose from the KTH Dominion section, a wide, elevated block of seats that took up an entire quarter of the hall's upper rows, and descended to the speaking platform. Drax was impressive when he spoke. He had a deep voice and a slow, deliberate way of forming sentences that made everything he said sound considered and reasonable. He began by thanking the Council for the opportunity to present what he called a framework for lasting peace and shared prosperity. He spoke about the difficulties of managing a Galaxy full of civilizations at different stages of development. He used words like balance and sustainability and mutual benefit. He smiled, or at least made the expression his species used for a smile, and he gestured with his broad hands, and he was very, very good at what he was doing. LRA watched him the way a person watches a card trick when they already know where the card is. The accord of mutual limitation was presented clause by clause on the main display screens that hung from the ceiling, a document of 47 articles, each one carefully worded, each one designed to sound fair. The first article established mutual non-aggression, reasonable. The second established shared resource zones, reasonable on the surface, but the specific boundaries of those zones placed every significant mineral-rich system near human space under joint council administration. The third article capped independent military development for all developing member civilizations. The specific definition of developing applied only to species who had been members for fewer than 100 years, which at this moment meant exactly one civilization, humanity. Article after article, the cage taking shape in plain sight, dressed in the language of cooperation. When Drax finished presenting the document, he stood back and opened the floor to responses. The representatives of the 17 present civilizations began to speak in sequence, and what followed was 2 hours of speeches that LRA had essentially predicted word for word in her notes 3 weeks earlier. The Sauron spoke about the importance of stability and voted to support the accord. Paladi spoke about shared futures and voted to support the Thern delegation. Said very little, but indicated they would not oppose the Velhari, the species whose colony worlds humanity had helped defend during the Plague Wars 11 years ago at significant cost in human ships and human lives. Sent their senior ambassador to the platform, et al. Graceful being with silver fur and dark eyes. The Velhari ambassador spoke beautifully about the complexity of galactic politics and the difficulty of choosing sides in matters of such great consequence, and then formally announced that the Velhari would abstain from the vote. The hall murmured. The Velhari abstention was not a surprise to V. Thorin or Drax, but it landed in the room like a small, quiet blow to anyone watching who had hoped for different. LRA looked at the Velhari ambassador as he returned to his seat. The ambassador did not look at her. One by one the others spoke, and one by one they aligned with the council majority, with the document on the screens above them. Civilization after civilization that humanity had traded with, cooperated with, defended alongside all of them, finding reasons today to look the other way or to actively support the cage. By the time the last of the 17 delegations had spoken, LRA had counted the votes in her head. The accord had more than enough support to pass. Only remaining procedural step was for the human delegation to sign or to formally refuse. The room grew quiet in a particular way, the kind of quiet that happens when a large group of people are all thinking the same thing and none of them want to be the first to say it. Everyone was looking at the woman at the small table on the floor level. V. Thorin returned to the speaking platform. The Galactic Council now invites Ambassador LRA Vasquez of the Human Commonwealth to address the hall. LRA stood. She was not a tall person, and the grand hall was an enormous room, and she had no elevate platform and no dramatic entrance. She simply stood up from her chair and walked a few steps to the speaking position. She looked up at 2,000 faces of 17 different species, all of them waiting, all of them certain they already knew how this conversation was going to go. Some were waiting for her to protest and demand amendments. Some were waiting for her to give a passionate speech about human rights and the unfairness of the accord. Some were waiting for her to ask for more time. The KE delegation in their elevated section watched with the calm patience of people who had already won. Drax sat with his hands folded and his copper eyes fixed on her with something that was not quite contempt but was very close to it. He had done this many times before he knew the shape of this moment. He was waiting for the part where the smaller civilization accepted the deal because they had no other choice. LRA looked at Drax for a moment, then she looked at V. Thorin, then she looked out at the full hall, all the seats, all the faces, all the cameras and recording devices that were broadcasting this session lived to 40 star systems. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was calm and clear, and the translation devices carried it to every ear in the room. "Before I respond formally, I would like to check something on my data pad. It will take just one moment." There was a brief confused pause in the hall. This was unusual. This was not a normal thing to say at this point in proceedings. Some delegates exchanged looks. Some of the Keth delegation shifted slightly in their seats. V. Thorne nodded graciously. "Of course, Ambassador." LRA walked back to her small table. She picked up the data pad. She looked at the screen. She stood there for about 15 seconds. Then she set the data pad back down on the table, and when she turned back to face the hall, something had changed in the way she was standing. It was subtle. Her shoulders had come back slightly. Her chin was a degree higher, but 2,000 delegates felt it before they could name it. She walked back to the speaking position and she smiled. The smile on LRA Vasquez's face was not warm, and it was not cold. It was the smile of someone who had been holding a secret for a very long time and had finally reached the moment where keeping it any longer served no purpose. 2,000 delegates stared at her from their rising rows of seats. The cameras drifted closer. The translation devices hummed quietly in every ear. Executive Drax of the KTH Dominion sat with his copper eyes fixed on her, unreadable. Waiting, Elder Vthorn stood at the edge of the speaking area with the practice patience of someone who had watched hundreds of smaller civilizations give their final speech before signing something they could not refuse. LRA looked at the hall for one full second of silence, then she spoke. "We stopped asking permission 72 hours ago." The hall did not immediately react, because for the first 2 seconds the words did not fully land. The translation devices carried the sentence to every listener in their own language, but the meaning took a moment longer to arrive, because the meaning was not what anyone in that room had prepared themselves to receive. Then the noise started. It was not a single sound. It was 2,000 beings reacting in slightly different ways at slightly different times. Chairs shifting, whispered questions, a sharp exclamation from somewhere in the K section, the clicking sound they made when they were startled. The wave of noise rolled up through the rows and hit the ceiling and came back down. V. Thorin raised one hand for order, and the noise dropped but did not disappear. "Hey, looked at Lero with something new in his expression, not yet alarm, but the very beginning of attention. Ambassador, would you clarify your meaning? Yes, LRA said. She turned slightly so that she was speaking to the full hall rather than just to V. Thorin. I would be happy to clarify. She paused for exactly one beat. 72 hours ago, 3 human deep space shipyards that were built outside Council monitored space became fully operational. Of the first ships have already launched. They are not subject to the military development caps described in Article 3 of the Accord you just presented, because they were never built inside the zone where those caps would apply. She let that sit for a moment, then continued. 60 hours ago, the Human Commonwealth completed and signed bilateral defense and trade agreements with the Fenari Collective, the Dusk Worlds Alliance, the Orth, the Muravani, the Second Serenti, and the Pale Shore Confederacy. 6 independent civilizations who were not invited to this summit because this council considered them too small to matter. The noise in the hall rose again. V. Thorin raised his hand again. LRA did not wait for full silence. She kept her voice level and clear, and the translation devices carried every word. 48 hours ago, human escort vessels entered the trade corridors that the KE Dominion has spent the last decade calling disputed territory. When KE patrol ships moved to intercept, they found human warships already positioned at every strategic point along those corridors. The blockade is over. It ended the day before yesterday. In the K section, Drax had gone completely still. He was not moving at all. He was the stillest thing in the room. LRA looked at him directly when she said the next part. In 24 hours ago, the Human Commonwealth conducted the final successful test of a transit drive technology that does not use the relay infrastructure that this council controls. Our ships no longer need your relay stations. We no longer need to pay the transit fees that have been the primary financial tool used to keep human expansion slow. We no longer need to request routing permission from any council body or any KE administered checkpoint. She looked away from Drax and back to the full hall. The relay monopoly that has been the foundation of council economic leverage for 3 centuries is, as of yesterday, no longer relevant to humanity. The Grand Hall of Accord was experiencing something it had possibly never experienced before in its 200-year history. Genuine collective shock. The noise had gone through 2 cycles and was now settling into something stranger than noise. It was the sound of 2,000 beings processing information that did not match the reality they had walked into the room with. V. Thorin was gripping the edge of the speaking platform. He was not gripping it hard enough to look undignified, but his knuckles had changed color. Ambassador, he said, and his smooth voice had something rough at the edges. Now these are extraordinary claims. Yes, LRA agreed. They are also true. Every piece of what I have just told you has been transmitted simultaneously to the public information networks of all 40 council member star systems. It is being verified right now by journalists, independent analysts, and government offices across the galaxy. You are welcome to check. She walked back to her table. She picked up the 47 article Accord of Mutual Limitation. She held it for a moment, then she set it back down on the table face down. You built a very thorough cage, she said to the Hall, you spent months preparing this document. You made deals with our trading partners. You convinced our allies to abstain. You isolated us carefully and professionally, and you brought us here alone. And you presented us with a choice between signing and being left with nothing. She looked at V. Thorin, and all of that was based on one assumption: that humanity was still the civilization. It was 40 years ago when we first joined this council. 40 years ago, we were new, we were learning, we were asking for things we did not yet know how to build for ourselves. She looked at Drax. You watched us very carefully for 40 years, she said. You watched us be patient, you watched us make concessions, you watched us ask for more time and accept smaller deals and work within the systems you controlled. And you decided that patience was weakness, that diplomacy meant we would always choose talk over action, that we would never reach the point where we stopped needing your permission. She let the silence hold for 3 full seconds. You spent 40 years waiting for humanity to stay small, she said. We spent 40 years learning everything we needed to make sure we never had to ask you for anything again. Nobody spoke. Drax was still not moving. The copper eyes that had watched her arrival with something close to amusement were now fixed on a point slightly above her head, as if he was recalculating something very quickly and needed to not be distracted. V. Thorin opened his mouth and closed it. He was 400 years old and had governed the most powerful political body in the known galaxy for nearly a century, and in this moment he did not have a procedural response ready, because there was no procedure for this. There was no clause in the Council Charter for a situation in which a junior civilization had quietly made the entire structure of leverage irrelevant before the leverage was applied. One of the cameras drifted very close to LRA's face, and she looked directly into it. She was not performing, she was not being dramatic, she was just saying the thing that was true. The accord of mutual limitation will not be signed today, she said. Not by us, not in this form, not under these conditions. If the Galactic Council wishes to discuss genuine framework for cooperation, one built on mutual respect and actual equality, humanity is willing to have that conversation. She picked up her data pad in her bag. We know where the table is. She walked toward the exit. Behind her, the grand hall erupted fully and finally into sound, real sound, uncontrolled sound, the sound of 2,000 beings whose understanding of the current state of the galaxy had just been replaced with something completely different, and in 40 star systems on screens and feeds and public networks. The broadcast was already being replayed. The 7 words were already everywhere. We stopped asking permission 72 hours ago. The first thing Elder V. Thorn did after the Grand Hall session ended was nothing. He sat in his private chamber on level 3, and he did nothing for 11 minutes. His aides stood near the walls and said nothing, because they had learned long ago that when V. Thorn was still like that, it was better to wait. When he finally moved, he called for his senior analyst, a small, fast-thinking Myrai named Korth, who had worked for him for 60 years, and he said 5 words: verify everything. She said now. Kor was gone for 34 minutes. When he came back, his face had the specific look it got when the information he was carrying was not what his employer wanted to hear. The shipyards are confirmed. Core said quietly, 3 construction. Platforms beyond the outer monitoring boundary, all 3 are already active. The first vessels launched within the last 4 days. The transit drive test is confirmed as well independent scientific. Observers in 2 separate systems have verified the results. The bilateral agreements with the 6 smaller civilizations were filed with their respective governments before this summit even began. They have been legally registered for 11 days. V. Than sat very still in the corridors. The Cath patrol ships withdrew. Korath said human warships are currently escorting 6 human colony transports through routes that were blockaded as recently as last week. The KE have not engaged them. The room was quiet. How long? Vithan said slowly. Did they plan this? Kor hesitated. Based on the construction timeline for the shipyards and the development timeline for the transit drive technology, our analysts believe active preparation began approximately 11 years ago. The Plague Wars period, during the time when human ships were deployed to assist colony worlds. He paused when everyone's attention was elsewhere. V. Thorin closed his eyes for a moment. He thought about the file he had read on LRA Vasquez. He thought about every human delegation that had sat across from him in the last 4 decades. Patient, polite, always asking for reasonable things, always willing to wait, always willing to negotiate. He had read patience as a cultural trait. He had read it as the defining characteristic of a civilization that wanted to belong. He had never once read it as a strategy. They used the summit as a reveal, he said, not a negotiation. They never intended to negotiate. They came here to tell us what had already happened. Kor said nothing because there was nothing useful to say. Across the station in a secured communications room, executive Drax of the Keth Dominion was on a private channel to the KE home system. The person on the other end of the channel was the Keth High Director, and the conversation was not going well. The military advisors had already run the numbers. The new human shipyards changed the production capacity equation significantly, not so much that humanity could match the K. A direct conflict, not yet, but enough that the cost of any military action against human worlds had increased dramatically, and that was before accounting for the 6 new allied civilizations that had just publicly announced their defense agreements with humanity. 3 of those 6 were in positions that would complicate any KE military movement toward human space. Their territories sat along routes that KE supply lines depended on. We cannot move against them without triggering a multi-front situation, one of the KE military advisors said on the channel. The allied civilizations were specifically chosen. They are not militarily powerful individually, but together, and in those positions they create a strategic problem that our fleet commanders are calling unsolvable without major losses. Drax said nothing. The transit drive is the larger long-term issue, the advisor continued. If humans no longer need relay stations, then within a generation their ships can reach any point in explored space without passing through any infrastructure. We can monitor or control the economic framework we built over 3 centuries was designed for a galaxy where relay access was the fundamental resource. Everything we built assumes that I know what we built. Drax said. The channel was quiet for a moment. Executive the High Director said from the home system, his voice careful. We need to consider a new approach. Drax looked at the wall of the communications room. He thought about the woman who had stood in the grand hall, the small, quiet woman at the small table who had come alone with one bag and a data pad and had said 7 words and walked out. He had spent 30 years reading civilizations. He had spent 30 years knowing exactly what a delegation would do before they did it. He had been wrong about this one, not because she had hidden her intelligence or her intention, but because he had decided before she arrived that he already understood what she was. He had seen patience and assumed limitation. He had seen diplomacy and assumed need. He opened a secure message channel to LRA Vasquez's quarters on level 7. He typed 4 words, "We should talk." Privately, he sent it and then he waited. The response came back in under 2 minutes. 3 words, "You know where." On the colony world of Nueva Esperanza, 11 light years from the nearest council relay station, a man named Danilo sat in a metal chair outside a converted shipping container that served as his home. He had a small screen propped against a water barrel and he was watching the broadcast replay for the 3rd time. He was 61 years old and had been on this colony for 19 years. His wife had left 7 years ago when the blockade made supply shipments unreliable and the farming cooperative he had helped build nearly collapsed. He had stayed because leaving felt like losing something he was not willing to give up. He did not have a good reason. He just stayed. He watched the small woman stand in the enormous hall. He watched her pick up the data pad. He watched the moment her shoulders changed. He had watched this particular moment twice already, and each time it hit him in the same place, somewhere behind the sternum, a kind of pressure that was not quite pain. When the 7 words came, he did not cheer. He did not shout. He sat in his metal chair outside his shipping container home in the dry wind of a colony world that had been quietly strangled for a decade, and he laughed. The laugh came out of him, unexpected and real, the kind of laugh that has been stored up for a long time before it finds its way out. His neighbor, a young woman named Sierra, who had been born on this colony and had never known what it felt like when the supply ships came on time, heard the laugh and came to the doorway of her own container. "Is it real?" she asked. She had seen pieces of the broadcast but had not watched from the beginning. "It is real," Danilo said. She sat down on an upturned crate and they watched the rest of it together. Back on the Eternal Accord, Elder Vithorin had finally moved from his chair and was standing at his chamber window, looking at the orange and brown gas giant below the station. Turned slowly, and the planet turned below it, and the stars did not move the way they appeared to move, but appeared to drift anyway. His most senior aide, a very old Tharn who had served him even longer than Corinth, stood near the door and waited. After a long time, Thorn said, "Bring me the full diplomatic history of the human commonwealth from the beginning, every session, every vote, every agreement, every concession." The aide nodded and left. Thorin stood at the window, and in his 400-year-old mind, he began going back through what he remembered, every human delegation, every human request, every moment he had watched humanity, except slightly less than they asked for, and call it progress. He began looking at those moments differently now, not as a pattern of weakness, but as a map he began to see one piece at a time how every concession had been real but had never cost humanity the things they had decided actually mattered. How every negotiation had been conducted honestly, but had always stopped short of touching certain areas, certain technologies, certain alliances, certain corridors of space that the human delegations had never pushed for loudly because they were already quietly handling them in other ways. The cage had been built carefully, but they had walked through a door that was never part of the cage's design because they had built the door themselves 11 years ago when nobody was watching. V. Thorin pressed one hand against the cold glass of the window and looked at the gas giant, and for the first time in a very long time, he was not sure what came next. 6 months passed. The new station was called the First Word, and it had been built by human engineers in 4 months at a point in space between 3 of the 6 newly allied civilizations. It was not as large as the Eternal Accord. It was not as impressive. It did not have asteroid carved walls or 2,000 seats or 200 years of history built into its corridors. What it had was clean lines and good light and meeting rooms that were designed so that no delegation sat higher than any other. Every seat at every table was at the same level. That had been a specific and deliberate choice by the architects, and everyone who received an invitation to the summit held there understood what that choice meant. LRA Vasquez was not alone this time. She walked into the main conference room with 6 other ambassadors beside her, the representatives of the Fenari Collective, the Dusk Worlds Alliance, the Orth, the Muravani, the Second Serenti, and the Pale Shore Confederacy. 7 civilizations who had spent years being quietly dismissed by the main council as too small to matter, and who had spent those same years watching humanity and deciding slowly and carefully that the humans were worth betting on. The Fenari ambassador was a tall being with pale green skin and 4 eyes who had personally approved the bilateral agreement with humanity 8 months before the summit on the Eternal Accord. She had done it without telling the council. She had done it by watching human colony ships struggle through blockaded corridors for 3 years and deciding she had seen enough. The Orth ambassador was old and slow moving, but had one of the sharpest political minds in any of the 7 systems they represented. When they broadcast from the Grand Hall had reached Orth, the old ambassador had watched it once, called her government council, and said, "We chose correctly." They took their seats on one side of the long table, on the other side after pause of about 4 minutes that everyone in the room noticed and nobody commented on. The Keth Dominion delegation entered. Drax was still there, lead diplomat. He had not been replaced, despite the failures of the summit 6 months ago, which told LRA something useful about how the KE evaluated their own people. They preferred someone who had been wrong and learned from it over someone new who had not been tested. She filed that thought away. Behind Drax came 3K advisors and 2 representatives of civilizations that had supported the original accord of mutual limitation. They did not sit quite as comfortably as they had 6 months ago. The broad section of raised seats they had occupied in the Grand Hall of Accord had no equivalent here. There was only the long flat table and chairs of equal height, and they sat down. In them, the Galactic Council sent a delegation to, not V. Thorn himself, but 2 senior representatives, and a team of advisors. The council's position had shifted in the months since the broadcast. The charter had been quietly revised twice. One of the revisions had removed the specific language that defined developing civilization in a way that only applied to humanity. The revision had been passed without much public comment, but everyone in political circles understood what it meant. It meant the council was trying to adjust to a world it had not designed. For LRA opened the session without ceremony. "We are here to discuss a framework for cooperation," she said. "Not limitation. Cooperation. That word means something specific, and we would like to spend today making sure we all agree on what it means before we write any of it down." What followed was 8 hours of conversation. It was not easy. It was not always polite. The KE delegation pushed back hard on the transit drive technology, specifically on whether humanity would share access to it or license it or keep it exclusive. LRA's answer was honest. Humanity would share access with civilizations that entered genuine equal partnerships and would not share it with civilizations that were trying to use access as a new form of leverage. That answer made 2 of the KE advisors visibly unhappy, but Drax himself was quiet for a long moment and then nodded in a way that suggested he had expected that answer and found it reasonable. The relay infrastructure question was the longest discussion of the day. The council representatives were most concerned about this because the relay network was not just an economic tool. It was also how emergency communications moved across the galaxy, how medical supply routes were managed, how response to natural disasters was coordinated. LRA had anticipated this concern and came prepared with a proposal. Humanity would help fund and build a parallel relay network using the new transit drive technology as a backbone, one that was administered by a joint body rather than by any single civilization or group of civilizations. The council representatives read the proposal twice and exchanged a long look with each other and then asked for 48 hours to consult with their governments. It was a reasonable request and LRA agreed to it. At the end of the 8 hours, Drax stood and said he was prepared to sign a preliminary statement of intent to negotiate a new cooperation framework on the terms discussed today. LRA asked him if the KE government had authorized that statement. He said they had. She asked when they had authorized it. He said 4 days ago. She looked at him for a moment. "You came prepared to sign today?" "We came prepared if the conversation went well." Drax said it went well enough. It was not a warm exchange, but it was an honest one, and in LRA's experience, honest was more valuable than warm. The statement was signed before the session officially closed. 7 signatures from the new alliance, and 2 from the KE delegation and 1 from the council representatives who said their full authority to sign would come after the 48-hour consultation, but that they wanted their names on the page today as observers who intended to become participants. When the room began to empty, LRA stayed at the table for a moment gathering her materials. A voice behind her said her name quietly. She turned. The speaker was the young Velhari diplomat she had seen in the corridor of the Eternal Accord the day she arrived 6 months ago. He was junior, too junior to have been part of the formal delegation at the earlier summit, but he had come as an observer today. He had large dark eyes, and silver fur that had the slightly uneven color of someone very young. And he looked like he had been working up to this moment for several minutes before. He finally spoke. "We should have stood with you," he said, "at the summit. I know my government's choice. I know the reasons they gave, but I watched the broadcast and I have thought about it every day since, and I believe we were wrong." He paused. "I am sorry." LRA looked at him. He was very young. She remembered being very young in diplomatic spaces and feeling the particular weight of carrying an apology that was not entirely hers to give, but that needed to be said by someone. "Are you speaking for yourself or for your government?" she asked. "For myself," he said. "My government is still deciding what they think." LRA nodded. "Then I accept it personally, and I appreciate it." She held his gaze for a moment. "Stand with us now. What happened before is already part of the record. It does not have to be the whole record." He stood up a little straighter when she said that. She picked up her bag and walked toward the viewport at the end of the room. The others had mostly filed out and the room was quiet, and the viewport looked at it open, unmapped space, more of it reachable now than at any point in human history. The transit drive had changed the geometry of the galaxy in a practical sense. The distances were the same, but the cost of crossing them had dropped by a factor that made old navigation maps feel like documents from a different era. There were systems out there that nobody had visited, yet not because they were too far, but because the infrastructure to reach them had never existed, and now it did. LRA did not stand at that viewport and feel triumphant. She felt tired in the good way, the way you feel after a long piece of work is finished, not because the work was easy, but because it was real and it mattered, and it is done. She thought about Danilo on Nuva Esperanza. She had received a message from him 3 months ago. He had not known her personally, but had found her public contact through a government directory and had sent 2 sentences. The supply ships were running on time again, and he had started rebuilding the farming cooperative. She had read it on a Tuesday morning before her first meeting and had sat with it for a few minutes before replying. She thought about the 40 years of patient work that had made that possible. Not her work, the work of everyone before her who had built the shipyards and developed the drive and made the alliances and held their positions quietly when the easier path would have been to keep asking for better terms on a smaller cave. Outside the viewport, the unmapped systems waited. Humanity had not ended negotiations forever. They were going to negotiate many more times with many more civilizations, and some of those negotiations were going to be hard, and some of them were going to fail before they succeeded. But something had changed permanently, and everyone who sat across a table from a human diplomat from this day forward was going to know one quiet, settled truth: the humans across from them had already thought further ahead than the current conversation. Whatever they were agreeing to, they had already decided they could live without it, and whatever they appeared to be asking for, there was a reasonable chance they had already found another way to get it. That was not a threat. It was not a weapon. It was simply the answer to a question the galaxy had been asking without knowing it was asking. What do you get when a civilization spends 40 years being patient, not because they are weak, but because they are building? You get this. You get a Station called the first word, and a table where every chair is the same. Height and a door that opens outward. The message arrived at exactly midnight. Ship time, and Ambassador Vera Chen was still awake when her console began to glow with an alien light she had never seen before. She pushed herself up from her desk and walked across the cold metal floor of her quarters aboard the ISS Defiant, humanity's first and finest interstellar diplomatic vessel. The holographic display flickered to life without her touching anything, and a symbol appeared in the air before her. 12 spiraling arms forming a perfect circle, the mark of the Galactic Council. Vieira had studied this symbol for 20 years, ever since humanity first detected signals from deep space and realized they were not alone in the universe. Now the Council was reaching out to them directly, and her heart began to beat faster in her chest. Ambassador Chen of the human species, a voice spoke from the hologram, cold and precise and completely without emotion. You have been summoned to appear before the Galactic Council at Nexus Prime to petition for provisional membership in our great union. The message continued for several minutes, explaining dates and coordinates and protocols that Vieira recorded carefully in her mind. When it finished, a second file appeared, the terms of membership that humanity would be expected to accept. She opened the file and began to read, and with each line her expression grew darker and more troubled. The outer planets of the Sol system would be transferred to Council control for what they called resource redistribution, which meant that Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune would no longer belong to humanity. All human technology would be reviewed and restricted according to Council standards, which meant that the scientific advances they had worked so hard to achieve could be taken away or limited, and most insulting of all, humanity would accept a guardian species to watch over their development for the next 300 years, treating them like children who could not be trusted to make their own decisions. Vieira read the terms twice, then a third time, making sure she understood every word. A chime sounded at her door, and she called out for the visitor to enter. Captain James Wheeler stepped inside, his uniform crisp despite the late hour, his gray eyes sharp with concern. I saw the transmission alert, he said, and I wanted to check on you personally. Vieira turned the holographic display so he could see it, and she watched his face as he read the same term she had just finished reviewing. His jaw tightened, and his hands curled into fists at his sides. This is not diplomacy, he said quietly. This is surrender with extra steps. That is exactly what I was thinking, Vera replied, and she allowed herself a small smile despite the weight of the moment. The door chimed again, and this time Admiral Marcus Stone entered, followed by Dr. Yuki Tanaka, the ship's chief xenostrategist and the smartest person Vera had ever met. They had both received copies of the transmission through their own secure channels, and they had come to discuss what humanity should do next. 60 years, Dr. Tanaka said as she studied the terms on the display. We spent 60 years watching the Council from the shadows before we revealed ourselves, and everything we learned told us this moment would come. Admiral Stone crossed his arms over his broad chest and frowned at the glowing text. We knew they would try to put us in a box, he said. We just did not expect them to be so open about it. Vieira nodded and pulled up additional files on her console, records that humanity had gathered through decades of careful observation. The Galactic Council was older than human civilization by thousands of years, and they had a pattern they followed with every new species they encountered. First came the invitation wrapped in words of friendship and opportunity. Then came the terms designed to strip away independence and resources. And finally came the guidance, which was really just control by another name. Vieira had seen what happened to species that accepted these terms. Their cultures faded, their populations declined, and eventually they disappeared, entirely absorbed into the council or simply forgotten. The KE accepted these same terms 400 years ago, Dr. Tanaka said, her voice heavy with the knowledge of what had followed. And now there are fewer than 10,000 of them left in the entire galaxy. The Luminari were poets and artists who created beauty that made other species weep with joy, Admiral Stone added, and after 2 centuries of council guidance, they stopped creating anything at all. The Vaughn built ships that could dance between stars like fireflies in the night, Vera said, and the council decided their technology was too dangerous and took it away, leaving them trapped on their home world forever. These were the fates that awaited humanity if they accepted the council's generous offer, but refusing was supposed to be impossible. No species had ever said no to the Galactic Council, not in 12,000 years of recorded history. The Council controlled trade routes and resources and technology that younger species needed to survive in a dangerous universe. Saying no meant isolation at best and destruction at worst, or so everyone believed. Vera looked at her 3 companions, these people she had worked with and trusted for so many years, and she saw the same fire burning in their eyes that she felt in her own heart. We did not spend 60 years preparing for this moment just to give up everything. That makes us human, she said. No. Admiral Stone agreed. We did not, Dr. Tanaka smiled, and it was not a kind smile, but the smile of someone who had been waiting for this fight for a very long time. I have been running simulations for the past decade, she said, planning for exactly this scenario, and I believe we have options that the Council has never considered. Captain Wheeler stepped forward and placed his hand on Vera's shoulder. Whatever you decide, Ambassador, the Defiance and her crew will stand with you. Vera took a deep breath and looked out the viewport at the stars that stretched endlessly into the darkness. Somewhere out there, the Council waited for humanity to come crawling to them and beg for acceptance. They expected fear and submission and gratitude for being allowed to join their ancient club. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Humanity had crawled out of the mud and taught themselves to walk upright. They had survived ice ages and plagues and wars that nearly destroyed them a dozen times over. They had split the atom and walked on the moon and built ships that could cross the void between stars, and they had done all of this without anyone's help or permission. The Galactic Council thought they were offering humanity a gift, but Vera saw it for what it truly was. Chains wrapped in silk and decorated with pretty words. She turned back to her companions and straightened her spine. Send a reply, she said, and her voice was calm and steady and absolutely certain. Tell them we accept their invitation to appear before the Council. Admiral Stone raised an IP And the terms he asked, Vera laughed. And it was a sound full of defiance and determination and something that might have been joy. We will discuss those in person, she said. I want to see their faces when we tell them no. The others laughed with her, and the sound echoed through the metal corridors of the defiance like a promise. Somewhere in the depth of space, the Galactic Council continued with their ancient routines, confident that humanity would fall in line like every species before them. They had no way of knowing that everything was about to change. A storm was coming to Nexus Prime, and its name was humanity. The journey to Nexus Prime took 17 days, and Vera spent every hour preparing for what was to come. She studied the Council's history until she could recite it from memory, learning the names and habits and weaknesses of every major species that held power in the galactic government. Dr. Tanaka worked beside her, building holographic presentations and gathering evidence that would shake the foundations of the Council's carefully constructed lies. Admiral Stone ran drills with the fleet that traveled alongside the Defiance 17 warships that moved through space like shadows, invisible to any sensor the Council possessed. When they finally arrived at Nexus Prime, they did not announce themselves through the proper channels as protocol demanded. Instead, Admiral Stone gave a single command, and all 17 human ships decloaked simultaneously in perfect formation around the Council's capital world. The effect was immediate and exactly what Vera had hoped for. Warning sirens screamed across Nexus Prime as defense systems detected ships that had not been there a moment before. Council military vessels scrambled to respond to what they assumed was an attack. Snorts, only to find the human fleet sitting quietly in orbit, weapons powered down, making no aggressive moves. How did they get so close without us seeing them? Demanded the Nexus Prime defense commander, a reptilian Sithro with scales the color of dried blood. No one could answer him because no one understood how it was possible. The Council's sensor networks were supposed to be the most advanced in the galaxy, capable of detecting a ship's approach from light years away, yet 17 human vessels had slipped through like ghosts and appeared at their doorstep without warning. This was humanity's first message to the Council: we are not what you think we are. Vera's shuttle descended through the atmosphere of Nexus Prime an hour later, flanked by escort fighters that the Council had insisted upon. She looked out the window at the world below and felt a strange mix of wonder and disgust. The Council's capital was beautiful in a cold and calculated way, with towers of crystal and metal reaching toward the sky and gardens of alien plants arranged in patterns too perfect to be natural. But beneath that beauty was something rotten, something that had been festering for thousands of years. The shuttle landed on a platform outside the grand chamber where representatives from hundreds of species had gathered to witness humanity's submission. Vera stepped out into the alien air and paused for a moment to look at the crowd that had assembled. There were beings of every shape and size imaginable, creatures of flesh and bone, entities of pure energy, hive minds that spoke with 1,000 voices, and ancient intelligences that had watched stars being born. All of them had come to see the newest species take its place at the bottom of the galactic hierarchy. Vera smiled at them and walked forward. With her head held high, Admiral Stone marched at her right side, his uniform, decorated with medals from a dozen campaigns that the council knew nothing about. Dr. Tanaka walked at her left, carrying a data pad that contained enough information to start a revolution. Behind them came a squad of human soldiers, not diplomats, their armor gleaming and their weapons visible for all to see. This was not how new species were supposed to present themselves. They were supposed to come alone or in small groups, humble and grateful, eager to prove their worthiness. Humanity had brought a war party to a peace summit, and the message was impossible to miss. The doors of the grand chamber swung open, and Vera stepped inside. The chamber was enormous, a vast dome that could hold tens of thousands of beings, with seats rising in tiers toward a ceiling that showed the stars themselves. In the center of the chamber stood the speaker's platform, where new species traditionally knelt to receive the council's blessing. Vera had no intention of kneeling. High Arbiter Zayav floated above the platform, an ancient being of pure energy who had guided the council for 8,000 years. His form shifted and pulsed with colors that had no names in human language, and when he spoke, his voice echoed through the minds of everyone present. Welcome, Ambassador Chin of the human species, he said, and his tone was warm with carefully practiced condescension. We are pleased that you have accepted our invitation to join the great family of civilizations. Vieira walked to the center of the chamber and stood on the speaker's platform, but she did not kneel. Thank you for the welcome, High Arbiter, she replied, and her voice carried through the chamber's perfect acoustics. But I need to correct a misunderstanding. Zyvix's energy form flickered with surprise, and murmurs rippled through the assembled delegates. A misunderstanding? The orbiter asked. Yes, Vera said, and she turned to face the thousands of watching aliens. We are not here to negotiate membership in your council. The murmurs became louder, confused and curious, and slightly alarmed. Admiral Stone stepped forward to stand beside Vera, his presence a silent reminder of the fleet waiting in orbit. Dr. Tanaka moved to her other side, her fingers dancing across her data pad as she prepared for what came next. We reviewed the terms you sent us, Vera continued, and we found them interesting, if somewhat outdated. High Arbiter Zayev pulsed with color that suggested irritation. The terms are standard, he said. Every species that has joined the council in the past 12,000 years has accepted them, and they have all prospered under our guidance. Have they? Vera asked, and her voice was sharp as a blade. She paused and looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of delegates who had never been challenged in their long lives. Where are the KE representatives today? She asked. I studied their history and learned that they once filled an entire section of this chamber with their delegates, but now I see only a handful. Uncomfortable silence spread through the chamber. Where are the Luminari? Vera pressed on. Their poetry once moved the entire galaxy to tears, but I do not hear their songs anymore. More silence, and some delegates began a shift in their seats. Where are the Vaughn, the greatest shipbuilders the galaxy has ever known? This time the silence was deafening. High Arbiter Zayev's form darkened with anger. Those species face challenges, he said carefully. Their decline was unfortunate, but not connected to their membership. The council, was it not? Vera asked, and She smiled like a predator who had spotted weakness in her prey. She turned back to face the orbiter directly. We spent 60 years watching your council. Before we revealed ourselves, she said. We watched and we learned and we documented everything. The chamber erupted in shocked exclamations. No species was supposed to be able to observe the council without being detected. It was simply not possible. And yet here stood the human ambassador, claiming that her people had been watching them for more than half a century. We know what happens to species that accept your terms, Vera said. We know about the resource extraction and the technology suppression and the guardian species that guide promising civilizations into extinction. She let those words hang in the air for a moment, and that is why we are here today, she concluded, not to negotiate membership, not to petition for acceptance, but to decline your generous offer. The Grand Chamber exploded into chaos. Delegates shouted and screamed and demanded explanations. The Drathigmany representatives rose from their seats and threatened war. The mindful collective questioned human sanity in voices that echoed through multiple dimensions. In High Orbiter XY, for the first time in thousands of years, did not know what to say. Vera stood calmly in the center of the storm, Admiral Stone and Dr. Tanaka beside her, and waited for the chaos to subside. She had delivered humanity's message. Now it was time to show them the evidence. It took nearly an hour for the Grand Chamber to return to something resembling order. Delegates who had never raised their voices in centuries were shouting at each other across the vast space, and several minor scuffles had broken out between species with old grudges. High Orbiter Zayavs eventually restored calm by flooding the chamber with a pulse of energy that forced everyone to stop and pay attention. You make serious accusations, Ambassador Chen, he said, his form still dark with barely controlled anger. Accusations without evidence are meaningless, and meaningless accusations from a primitive species are simply insulting. Vera did not react to the word primitive. She had expected them to try to diminish humanity, to make them seem small and foolish in front of the assembly. Instead, she turned to Dr. Tanaka and nodded. High Arbiter Dr. Tanaka said, stepping forward with her data pad raised. I am Dr. Yuki Tanaka, and I have spent the past 30 years studying the Galactic Council from the shadows. She pressed a button and a massive holographic display sprang to life above the speaker's platform. What I am about to show you is not theory or speculation, she continued. It is documented evidence gathered from Council archives, intercepted communications, and direct observation of your operations. The first image showed a star map with hundreds of colored dots spread across it. These are the species that have joined the Council over the past 4,000 years, Dr. Tanaka explained. The green dots represent species that are still thriving, the yellow dots represent species in decline, and the red dots represent species that have gone extinct or been reduced to insignificance. The assembled delegates stared at the map, and many of them grew very quiet. The red dots outnumbered the green dots by a factor of 3 to 1. Coincidence? High Orbiter Zayavek said quickly. The galaxy is a dangerous place, and not every species has what it takes to survive. An interesting theory, Dr. Tanaka replied. So let me show you what these species have in common. The display shifted to show detailed records, documents that bore the official seals of the Galactic Council itself. Every species marked in red accepted a guardian from the same group of elder races, Dr. Tanaka said. Specifically, they accepted guardians from the Drath Hegemony, the Void Consortium, or the Stellar Collective. She highlighted the patterns in the data. Under the guidance of these guardians, the declining species were encouraged to relocate their populations to more efficient planets, which just happened to free up their home worlds for resource extraction. Angry murmurs began to spread through the chamber. They were advised to simplify their technologies to meet Council standards, which just happened to eliminate their ability to develop independent space travel. The murmurs grew louder, and they were supported through cultural exchange programs that just happened to replace their traditions with dependency on Council systems. Dr. Tanaka let the display speak for itself, showing document after document, record after record, a trail of evidence that stretched back thousands of years. The KE were miners, she said, pulling up images of a proud insectoid species. They controlled vast mineral reserves that the Drath wanted, and within 200 years of accepting Drath guidance, those reserves were transferred to Drath control, and the KE population had dropped by 90%. Delegates turned to look at the Drath representatives who sat in stony silence. The Luminari were artists who developed a form of light-based communication that could have revolutionized galactic networking. Dr. Tanaka continued. The Void Consortium offered to help them refine technology, and within a century, the Luminari had forgotten how to use it themselves. She pulled up more evidence, more records, more undeniable proof that Vaughn built ships that could jump between stars in ways the Council had never seen, and when they refused to share their secrets, the Stellar Collective arranged for their world to be quarantined due to a supposed disease outbreak that has never been documented anywhere else. The chamber was completely silent now. Every delegate understood what they were seeing, even if many of them did not want to believe it. The Galactic Council, the ancient institution that claimed to protect and guide younger species, had been systematically destroying them for thousands of years. High Arbiter Xivex's form flickered rapidly, cycling through colors that had no translation in any known language. These documents could be fabricated, he said, but his voice lacked the confidence it had held before. Human technology is primitive, but perhaps they have developed some skill at creating false records. We anticipated that argument, Dr. Tanaka replied calmly. She pressed another button and new data flooded the display. These are not copies, she said. These are the original files pulled directly from Council archives by infiltration. Programs we planted decades ago. Gasps echoed through the chamber. We have access to your systems, Dr. Tanaka explained. We have had access for 40 years, and we have been watching everything you do. She smiled, and it was not a friendly expression. We know about the secret meetings where you decide which species to target next. We know about the bribes paid to Guardian species for successful integration, and we know about the protocols you follow to ensure that no evidence survives once a species has been eliminated. The Drath ambassador rose from his seat, his scaled face twisted with rage. This is an act of war, he bellowed. You have violated Council sovereignty, stolen protected information, and now you dare to accuse us of crimes against the galaxy. Admiral Stone stepped forward and his voice cut through the chaos like a knife. Sit snorts down, he said. Simply, the Drath ambassador did not sit. Your fleet cannot stand against the combined might of the Council, he snarled. We will crush your ships and burn your worlds and make an example of your species that will be remembered for 10,000 years. Admiral Stone looked at the Drath with something that might have been pity. You still do not understand, do you? He said quietly. He turned to address the entire chamber. We did not come here with 17 ships because we needed them to fight, he explained. We brought them to show you something. He activated his own communicator and spoke a single word: demonstrate. In orbit above Nexus Prime, the human fleet began to move. Every delegate, the chamber could see it through the transparent sections of the dome, could watch as 17 ships executed a maneuver that should have been impossible. They jumped not away from the planet, but around it, performing micro jumps that repositioned them in perfect defensive formation in less than 3 seconds. The Council's military experts had told their leaders that such jumps were theoretically possible but would require technology that did not exist. Humanity had that technology. They had developed it in secret, tested it without detection, and now they had revealed it at the perfect moment. We are not a primitive species begging for scraps at your table, Admiral Stone said, as the chamber erupted in fresh chaos. We are a civilization that has been preparing for this moment for 60 years. He looked directly at the Drath ambassador, who had finally sat back down. We are not afraid of your threats. Vera stepped forward again, taking control of the moment. We came here to show you the truth, she said. Not because we want to destroy the Council, but because we believe the galaxy deserves better. She looked around at the thousands of delegates, species who had lived under the Council's shadow for so long that they had forgotten there could be any other way. You have a choice now, she said. You can continue to pretend that everything is fine, or you can start asking questions about what your Council has really been doing for the past 12,000 years. She paused and let her words sink in. Either way, the truth is out there now, and it cannot be hidden. Again, the Grand Chamber had descended into something that resembled a war zone. Without weapons, delegates screamed accusations at each other across the vast space, and ancient alliances that had stood for millennia were crumbling in real time. The Drath found themselves surrounded by species demanding answers, their usual arrogance replaced by desperate denial. The Void Consortium had retreated to a corner of the chamber, their representatives huddled together and refusing to speak to anyone. The Stellar Collective had simply vanished, their seats empty, their delegates having fled through private exits before the mob could reach them. Through it all, High Arbiter Zayavx floated above the chaos, his energy form flickering and pulsing as he tried to restore order. But for the first time in 8,000 years, no one was listening to him. Ver watched the chaos with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. She had not wanted to destroy the Council. She had simply wanted to expose the truth. What happened next was not entirely in her control. Ambassador Jin, a voice called out from the crowd. Vera turned to see a delegation approaching her, led by a tall being covered in iridescent feathers that shimmered with every color of the rainbow. This was Ambassador Kira of the Melody, a species known for their music and their strict neutrality in council politics. My people have long suspected that something was wrong with the council, Kira said, her voice carrying the harmonic undertones that made Melly's speech so distinctive, but we never had proof and we were too afraid to look for it. She bowed her feathered head in Clear's throat, a gesture of respect. Thank you for showing us the truth. Before Vera could respond, another delegation pushed forward, the Thornback Confederacy, warriors who had been members of the council for 3,000 years, stood before her with their leader at the front. We knew, the Thornback leader said, his rough voice heavy with shame. We knew what the elder races were doing, but we kept silent because we feared them. He lowered his massive head. We were cowards, and our cowardice made us complicit in genocide. More delegations approached, each with their own confessions and apologies and questions. Species that had been rivals for centuries stood together, united by the realization that they had all been manipulated by the same hidden forces. Vieira listened to them all, answering questions where she could, offering understanding where words were not enough. Admiral Stone remained at her side, watching for any signs of danger. But the mood in the chamber had shifted from hostility to something else entirely. Hope, perhaps mixed with anger and shame, and a desperate desire to make things right. Dr. Tanaka moved through the crowd, sharing data with delegates who wanted to see the evidence for themselves, helping them understand the scope of what had been done. Hours passed and still the discussions continued. The Drath ambassador finally stood again, his scales pale with stress, and demanded the floor. This is all very dramatic, he said, trying to project confidence he clearly did not feel. But it changes nothing, snorts. The council has maintained peace in this galaxy for 12,000 years, and whatever mistakes may have been made in the past do not erase that achievement. He pointed at Vera with a clawed finger. These humans have admitted to infiltrating our systems, to spying on sovereign governments, to stealing protected information. They are criminals, not heroes, and they should be punished accordingly. Admiral Stone laughed, and the sound echoed through the chamber. You want to talk about punishment? He asked. Stepping forward, he pulled up a new display, one that Dr. Tanaka had prepared specifically for this moment. We did not just spy on your government, he said, we also shared what we learned. The display showed a map of the galaxy, with lines of light spreading out from Nexus Prime to hundreds of distant Point 42 species beyond Council space have now received complete copies of everything we showed you today, Admiral Stone explained. They know about the Guardian program, they know about the resource extraction, they know about the engineered extinctions. The Drath ambassador's scales went from pale to completely white. You cannot do that, he whispered. That information is classified at the highest levels. Was classified, Admiral Stone corrected him. Past tense, he smiled, and there was no warmth in it. Right now, civilizations across the galaxy are learning the truth about what the Council really is, and they are making decisions based on that information. The chamber erupted again. But this time, the noise was different. There was fear in it, fear of what would happen when the rest of the galaxy learned what had been hidden from them. High Orbiter Zyvix finally descended. From his position above the platform, his form had stabilized into something. That might have been resignation. "What do you want, Ambassador Chin?" he asked, his voice no longer echoing through minds but speaking directly to her. "Alone, you have destroyed our reputation, exposed our secrets, and turned our allies against us. Surely, you did not do all this without a goal in mind." Vera looked at the ancient being, this entity that had guided the council for 8,000 years, and she felt something unexpected. "Pity, I told you when I arrived," she said quietly. "We did not come here to destroy you." She turned to face the chamber, raising her voice so everyone could hear. "Humanity did not seek out the council because we wanted power or revenge," she said. "We sought you out because we believed the galaxy could be better than it is." She gestured at the chaos around them. "Look at what your system has created: fear, suspicion, exploitation, and death. Species that should be working together are instead trapped in a hierarchy that benefits only those at the top." Ver shook her head. "We refused your terms because we will not be part of that system, but we are not asking you to tear everything down either." She pulled up a new display, one that showed a simple document with a title at the top: the Nexus Accords. "This is our proposal," she said, "a new framework for galactic cooperation based on equality, transparency, and mutual benefit." The chamber fell silent as delegates read the document. It called for the dissolution of the Guardian species program and the return of resources taken from exploited civilizations. It proposed a new governing body where every member species had an equal voice, regardless of their age or technological development. It established protections for younger civilizations and requirements for the elder races to share technology openly rather than hoard it for themselves. It was everything the current council was not. "This is impossible," the Drath ambassador said, but his voice was weak. "You cannot simply erase 12,000 years of tradition." "We are not erasing anything," Vera replied. "We are offering you a choice." She looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of delegates from 100 different species. "You can continue with the old ways, clinging to power that you no longer deserve, watching as more and more species turn away from you, or you can join us in building something new." Ambassador Kira of the Melody stepped forward. "The Melody support the Nexus Accords," she said, her voice carrying through the chamber like a song. "We will be the first to sign." The Thornback leader moved to stand beside her. "Confederacy supports the Accords as well," he said. "It is time we stop being cowards." More delegations came forward, one after another, species that had been silent for centuries, finally finding their voices. The Drath watched in horror as their coalition collapsed around them, their allies abandoned them, their subjects turned against them, and their power evaporated like morning mist in the sunlight. High Arbiter Zayav observed it all, his ancient form flickering with emotions that had no names. "You have started a revolution, Ambassador Chen," he said. Finally, Vera nodded. "I know," she replied, "but it was long overdue." She extended her hand toward the Arbiter, human gesture of peace and partnership. "The question now is whether you will stand against the revolution or join it." The chamber held its breath, waiting for the ancient being's response. The fate of the galaxy hung in the balance. High Arbiter Zayov stared at Ver's extended hand for what felt like an eternity. The gesture meant nothing to him physically. His energy form could not shake hands, but he understood the symbolism behind it. The human ambassador was offering him a chance to be part of something new, instead of being swept away with the old. 8,000 years of memories flickered through his ancient consciousness. He remembered when the council had been young and idealistic, when the first species had come together to share knowledge and protect each other from the dangers of a hostile universe. Somewhere along the way, that idealism had been corrupted. The elder races had grown comfortable with their power, and they had slowly begun to see younger species not as partners but as resources to be exploited. Zyvex had watched it happen, had even participated in it, telling himself that it was necessary for stability, that the alternative would be chaos and war. But looking at the human ambassador now, seeing the fire in her eyes and the determination in her stance, he realized something that shook him to his core. The council had been dying for a very long time. They had just been too proud to see it. "You ask me to abandon everything I have built," he said, finally, his voice heavy with the weight of millennia. "No," Vera replied gently. "I am asking you to build something better." The chamber remained silent. Thousands of beings watching this moment that would shape the future of the galaxy. Zalvix's form flickered one final time, and then he reached out with a tendril of pure energy and touched Vera's extended hand. Light flowed between them, warm and bright and full of something that felt like hope. "Council as it exists today is finished," Zyke said, and his voice echoed through the minds of every being in the chamber. "I, High Arbiter Zavex, formally dissolve the Galactic Council and call for the formation of a new body, one that will be guided by the principles of the Nexus Accords." The chamber erupted into noise, but this time it was not chaos, it was celebration. Species that had been rivals for centuries embraced each other. Ambassadors who had never spoken before exchanged words of friendship and hope. And somewhere in the crowd, someone began to sing. The melody joined in, their voices rising in a harmony that transcended language and species, a song of renewal and possibility that spread through the chamber like wildfire. Vera stood at the center of it all, tears streaming down her face, overwhelmed by what they had accomplished. Admiral Stone put a hand on her shoulder and smiled. "Not bad for a primitive species," he said. She laughed and wiped her eyes. "We have a lot of work ahead of us," she replied. Dr. Tanaka joined them, her data pad still in hand, but her usually serious expression replaced by something approaching wonder. "I ran simulations of this scenario 1,000 times," she said, "and I never imagined it would end like this." "What did your simulations predict?" Vera asked. Dr. Tanaka looked around at the celebrating delegates. "War," she admitted, "destruction, decades of conflict before anything changed. I never thought they would actually listen to us." Vera followed her gaze, watching as representatives of species she had never heard of approached the human delegation with offers of friendship and alliance. "Sometimes people surprise you," she said. "Sometimes all they need is someone brave enough to speak the truth." The celebrations continued for hours, but eventually the work of building a new galactic order had to begin. Over the following weeks, the Nexus Accords were refined and expanded. with input from dozens of species. The framework Vera had proposed became the foundation for a new government, one that truly represented all its members equally. The elder races that had exploited younger civilizations were stripped of their special privileges and required to make restitution for their crimes. The Drath hegemon resisted at first, retreating to their core systems and threatening war, but when 60 species signed a mutual defense pact against them, they quickly reconsidered. The Void Consortium simply collapsed, their members scattering to different factions as their leaders faced justice for thousands of years of exploitation. The Stellar Collective attempted to flee beyond the boundaries of explored space, but human ships tracked them down and brought them back to face trial. Justice was not quick or easy, but it was thorough. Species that had been on the edge of extinction received resources and support to rebuild their populations. Technologies that had been suppressed were released freely to anyone who wanted them. Trade routes that had been controlled by cartels were opened. Ships and the economy of the galaxy began to transform in ways no one had predicted. A year after that fateful day in the Grand Chamber, the reformed Galactic Assembly held its first official session. Representatives from over 400 species gathered in a new chamber built specifically for this purpose. Circular space where every seat was equal and no one sat above anyone else. The session opened with a vote for the Assembly's inaugural speaker, a position that would rotate every 5 years between different species to ensure no one accumulated too much power. Ambassador Vera Chen was elected unanimously. She stood at the central podium and looked out at the sea of faces, some human, most not, all of them looking back at her with respect and trust she had worked hard to earn. 1 year ago, she began. I stood before the Galactic Council and told them that humanity would not accept their terms. I told them that we refused to kneel. She paused, remembering the fear and uncertainty she had felt in that moment. The knowledge that everything could have gone terribly wrong. Many of you thought we were crazy, she continued. Some of you thought we were arrogant, and a few of you probably thought we were suicidal. After all, no species had ever said no to the council before. Quiet laughter rippled through the chamber, but we knew something that the council had forgotten. Vera said, we knew that power without principle is just tyranny waiting to happen, and we knew that the galaxy deserved better than what it had been given. She gestured to the assembly around her. Look at what we have built together in just 1 year. Species that were enemies are now allies. Technologies that were hoarded are now shared, and civilizations that were dying are beginning to heal. Her voice grew stronger. This is what happens when you refuse to accept that things cannot change. This is what happens when you stand up and demand something better. She thought of all the work still to be done, the challenges that lay ahead, the inevitable conflicts that would arise as the galaxy adjusted to its new reality. But she also thought of the messages she had received from the survivors of the Cath, thanking humanity for giving them hope. She thought of the Luminari, artists who had begun creating again for the first time in centuries. She thought of the Vaughn engineers who were finally free to build the ships they had always dreamed of. We are humanity, she said, her voice ringing through the chamber. We are stubborn and foolish, and we never know when to Give up, we fight even when we cannot. Win, we hope even when hope seems impossible. And we refuse to accept any limit that someone else tries to place on us. She smiled, and now we are part of something bigger than ourselves. Galactic family that stretches across the stars, united not by force but by choice. The chamber rose as one. Applause thundering from every corner. Vieira looked out at the assembly, at the future they were building together. And she felt something she had not felt in a very long time, pride not just in humanity but in all of them. They had taken a chance on something better, and together they had made it real. Back on Earth, children looked up at the stars and dreamed of worlds they would one day visit. On Nexus Prime, former rivals worked side by side to build a government that would last for millennia. And across the galaxy, species that had once been forgotten began to remember who they truly were. Humanity had refused diplomacy. They had refused to kneel, and in doing so they had changed everything. The story was just beginning, but its first chapter had ended in triumph. Ambassador Vera Chen, Speaker of the Galactic Assembly, took her seat and prepared for the work ahead. There was a galaxy to build, and she could not wait to get started.